Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out to Airport Park Expansion Community Event today. My name is Karen Ginsberg. I'm the Director of Community and Cultural Services for the city, and I'm delighted to be here because I was looking back at my old records and realized that we opened the existing park in 2007. So here we are, almost 10 years later, planning for the next 12 acres, and that is really, really, really exciting. I wanted to take a moment and tell you a little bit about some housekeeping things. There are restrooms on the second floor of the airport building. You can take the elevator up, and restrooms in the existing park, so feel free to use those. I wanted to introduce Councilmember Glean Davis, who is here with us today. And our Airport to Park organization that seems to be here in force. Look at the green t-shirts, which is fabulous. I just see Elaine Polachek, our Assistant City Manager, who just walked into the tent. And I'm sure there'll be others showing up as the day goes on. For one moment, I wanted to give you some background about Mark Rios before I introduce him to present some of the concept ideas for our 12 acres. Mark is trained in both architecture and landscape architecture, and he sees these two disciplines as inseparable, which I think is very important for this project. He founded Rios Associates in 1985 with a vision to imagine, design, and build complete environments. Every project that bears the firm's stamp traces its lineage to his innate curiosity and ability to see things from multiple perspectives. The firm was renamed Rios Clemente Hale Studios in 2003 to acknowledge its focus on collaboration across all disciplines. And finally, from 2001 to 2007, Mark was the chair of the landscape architecture program at USC. He also served on the UCLA School of Arts and Architecture faculty from 86 to 95 and was a visiting instructor at Harvard's Graduate School of Design in 1990. With that, I'd like to introduce Mark Rios.
Thank you, Karen. That's like way too much information. But anyway, it's really exciting to be here with everybody today. I see so many familiar faces, and I know that collectively we've been talking about this for many years, more actively for at least 2 years. We've been working on it in a real direct way for about 6 months, and I think this is the first time that we're getting together to really look at designs. So it's a real milestone. Is this working okay? Can everybody hear me? Great. So I have a few things I want to do first, and I think that it's... Okay, is that better? Okay, so the first thing that's really important for all of you to know, there are a lot of amazing, talented, terrific people working on this project, so I want to do a few introductions. So first of all, everybody that's working in our office, Sebastian, Jennifer, would all of you guys stand up, please? Grant, Jonathan, Brian, Mike. So really a talented team of designers. You guys have got sort of the best. Architects and landscape architects need people that are really in the trenches with specific information that we don't have. And so we have probably the best engineering firm globally, Arab. And Tony and Matt are here from Arab that are helping us with civil and acoustic engineering. There they are. Parking and traffic and circulation are really key for this project to make a really safe park. And Pat Gibson with Gibson Transportation is helping us with that. He's amazing. There's going to be a lot of sports fields here. So the sports force is here, Jim and Patrick. Can you guys stand up? Great. You'll see some really amazing boards in the next field of a lot of the botanical life we're thinking about. And we have an amazing consultant, Rana Creek, that's helping us with that. We've worked with them on other projects, and their expertise is pretty amazing. Jessica's here from Otter Creek. I think our office and all of you have a really firm belief that the incorporation of art into every project makes it more unique and creates a stronger sense of place. And so Scott Flax is here, and he's a colorist that's working with us on the project. So what I'd like to do is to really just go through a little bit of the background information and then get into our 3 schemes today. I think it should be a really great hour or 2 here, as long as we can stand it with the heat. We're going to start in this tent, and I'm going to go through a presentation. And then there's 2 other locations, one on the other side of this tent and one back over there. And the idea is we can sort of move back and forth between those. There's a lot of information in both those locations. You have this passport to write down your thoughts and feelings about everything. So we really need all of your input. That's the reason why we're here today, to listen, to get good feedback from you. One last thing I want to make sure everybody does is to go and stand sort of at the end of that tent and look into the tie-down space. We've arranged this line of cones that go all the way to the street, and that's the width of sort of a runway idea that you'll see in a few schemes, and it's really helpful to visualize the scale of it. And so before you leave, make sure you go down and you look at all those cones all lined up going down to Centinela. Okay. Our team, fancy screen here, isn't this technology great? The airport, which all of you know very well. And here is the overall airport, and our site is basically located in this location. And a lot of you remember this diagram. I think there's some copies of the table. About 2 years ago, we worked with the Airport to Park, and this is a diagram that shows what we heard. This is a listening diagram. So through a whole series of exercises and sort of design ideas, we compiled this of everything that we heard, what people thought might work in the park. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that we're sort of working over here in this area, but we want to make sure that anything we do here could conceivably work with the bigger idea. So today we're really excited to start talking about this first 12 acres. With the existing 8 acres in the current park, we have about 20 acres that we're starting with, which is an amazing public open space. But all the decisions we make here, we want to keep in the back of the mind that someday they might have sort of a bigger expression. And so we keep looking back at this diagram. So here's our site. And we're in this location right here. There's 2 specific pieces of the site. One is the tie-down area up here that's just a little under 7 acres. And then the area by Barker that's around a little over 5 acres. And they're disconnected sites. And one of the things that I think we're really excited about, and that I think really shows the foresight of the city, is they're saying you can look at the entire parcel and think about the whole piece, how it all works together. And that yes, your work is really going to be located in this location and probably in this location, but we really don't want to have 3 disconnected places. This place, and that place. And so if we need to start making some modifications to tie all this place together, let's find the best solution. Let's find the way to really make this be a cohesive 20-acre place as opposed to a 6-acre place, an 8-acre place, and a 6-acre place. So I think that's really important. So we're right here. The other tent is over here. Those cones that I talked about are sort of all lining up out to the street. And the other tent is over in this location. Thank you. It's important for all of us to understand really how big this space is. And so here's that shape that we were just looking at. And here is the Santa Monica Pier. I'm sure all of you have sort of walked, along the pier, back and forth past the parking lot. You have a sense of how long that space is. This is a big park. 20 acres is a lot of space. And when you see it compared to the pier, it immediately sort of puts in a reference of how big a space it really is. Here's a scale representation of Clover Park. You can see Clover Park underneath it, and it's about the size of Clover Park. A few parts of it, don't include, and a few parts of our park go outside of Clover Park, but overall it's about the same size of Clover Park. And here's a image of this park over Tonga Park, and this is about 3 times that size. So as you're starting to kind of think about how big this place is and what the scale of it, how long it takes to walk from one side to the other, it's important to kind of think back at places we all know, and it helps us inform ourselves about how big this place is. So I think we want to always be doing our work in reference with what's happening globally. How do we design a park here that's really part of a whole global conversation about open space and recreation? And so we always look at sort of the best examples globally to inspire us how we make decisions here. And there's 2 examples I want to show which are really pretty simple, and we've talked about them a lot, and probably many of you have been to both these places. The first one is Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, where they closed the airport down and basically fenced it and allowed people to occupy it and use it. And the idea was that they would never do any maintenance to this place, and that slowly the runways would sort of disintegrate and new plant families would come in and new ecologies would be developed. And this place, which started as an industrial landscape of an airport, will finally someday become kind of a wild landscape. And so that whole process of nature taking back a man-made form is really what this park is about. And it's really pretty amazing. I've been there probably 6 times, and to stand in those spaces are unlike any space you've ever been in, because none of us had the opportunity to ever be on a runway. We can't do that. But to be in a space that's that big is pretty amazing. And here's sort of some examples of all the different kinds of community events that happen, festivals and parades, lots of bikes, kites. Most importantly, what makes this space work, I think, is they didn't do too much. It's not over-designed. And that's really the key, I think, is that it's very flexible, allows for lots of different things to happen. And so as we're starting to look at what to do here, yes, there are definite program requirements we need to solve, but at the same time, we want to keep it a little open-ended. So things that we can't think of today that we might need tomorrow can happen in those places. It's not over-designed. Everybody probably knows this by now, I hope, the High Line. And the High Line is another really good example of an industrial landscape which has been reclaimed and made into a public place. That's exactly what we're doing here. And what's, I think, beautiful and unique about the High Line is they didn't try to take away the history of it. They left the history apparent. So some of the rail tracks are still there. Some of the ties for the railway make benches. They're not exactly the same ones, but they're sort of reminiscent of it. And then the nature, the ecological systems are basically the ecological systems that grow in that environment, and they're assembled in a disassembled, sort of a disordered way. So it really feels like you're in a native landscape. And as we know, it's been wildly successful. It's really reinvigorated the whole meatpacking area. And it has that combination of being a new place, but we also had the memory of the old place there. And so for our project here, I think those values are really important. We want to solve all of our current program needs. We want to keep it a little open-ended for things we can't imagine that might happen in the future, but we want to respect its past. We want to respect, I think, some idea that it was an airport, but also there's a past before the airport, which is sort of the native California landscape, particularly as it gets close to the coast, that this piece of earth was all about. And so how do we sort of incorporate all those things into a design? So the High Line, you can see, again, some of the furniture and the way people hang out in it. It's really a very successful solution. Let's see if I can, there. Oops. Let's shrink it a little bit there. Thank you. We've been talking about this project with all of you and in our office of having 3 areas or 3 objectives. And we keep talking about the idea of performance, the idea of culture, and the idea of ecology. And all of them are really important. And it's the intersection of all those things that's going to make a really great place. Performance really deals with all the activities that we will be doing here. The sports fields, sort of direct games and sports and writing, all the kinds of things to do with us performing to the best of our abilities. The culture of a place is really important. How does it provide the place for communities to have events, people to have birthday parties like we see? How does it provide support for the community that embraces its culture? And finally, I would say the site isn't devoid of ecology right now, but it's almost devoid of ecology. And how do we start lifting up various places in the site and reintroducing natural ecological systems to basically heal the site and promote a more healthy park place? So in thinking about performance, it's, I think, helpful for us to kind of understand where we are in the city. So here's Airport Park, and if you look at, for example, where are the locations of other similar size soccer fields? There are soccer fields at John Adams Middle School. There are soccer fields closer to the beach. But this is a really important place for sports, and the City Council has directed us to look really seriously at adding more fields here. This is really an ideal location to sort of concentrate sports fields and performance. And so we have different schemes today that look at the quantity of fields we may be able to provide. So one of our goals is definitely to maximize fields. And we have a couple different solutions, and there's trade-offs. If you have 4 fields, you get certain space left over for other cultural or ecological activities. If you have 3 fields, there's more ancillary spaces. And so we really want feedback from all of you today on what you think is the best fit and capacity for the site. Our objective is to make the fields be multi-purpose fields. Yes, we have to make regulation soccer fields, but we want to have a combination of different types and sizes of fields so that there's really a flexible use of all those places. And we're spending lots of time looking at basically all those possibilities. Our team partners, the Sports Force, have done lots and lots of projects like this, and so they're helping us with test fits of how those might be located. In addition to sports fields, we like to have other diverse recreation and sports activities, and so we're trying to look at where we might fit in other kinds of activities in between the various sports fields. Culture. So in both the High Line and in Tempelhof, the idea of trying to have some kind of memory of the place was really important for those designs. And so we keep looking back at the history of the airport and its different sort of periods of development and trying to understand how can we tell the story of that industrial landscape. The solution that we come up with collectively needs to be one that is beautiful and light-handed, that it's not thematic and gimmicky, but it needs to sort of just address this site and what its role has been in the past. Our goal is to have flexible spaces so different kinds of community events can be set up, different kinds of fairs and festivals, and a whole range of other kinds of community activities, which might also include some community gardens. In the various tents, you're going to see lots of images of different kinds of things that might happen in the park, and we'd like your input on what your priorities are. There's probably not room for everything, and so part of the goal for today is to get feedback on what you think is essential and what you'd like to have if there's additional room. Okay, and ecology. We don't see this at the airport right now, and we're probably not going to see this at the airport right now, but there are a lot of lessons from this Mediterranean climate and sort of the natural habitat that might inform some of the spaces in between all the fields. I think we all are familiar with various kinds of bioswales and ways to collect water, retain water, purify water. So that's definitely going to be an important part of this project. We have a lot of surface area on this project. The fields are a lot of flat area. There is going to be a lot of paving. And so how we sort of deal with that water in a really responsible way and clean it before it goes someplace else is important. I love this image here of just sort of breaking up the runway and letting things sort of grow in between it. I'm not suggesting we do something that looks like that, but I think conceptually the idea is that, to start taking up the ground, getting air to the soil, planting things, let a process of ecological transformation begin. And in doing that, I think lots of other things will happen. We will be able to increase some wildlife, some birds, insects. Hopefully it will promote education, learning more about the ecosystems of the place, and even through things like the community garden are really great opportunities for education. One of the main principles that I think are leading all the designs is this idea about making a fit for the context that ties things together. Right now, Airport Avenue is sort of the main circulation for this whole side of the airport, and it connects the park. But there's really not much visual orientation to what's here. You can drive by on Centinela pretty quickly and not necessarily miss that intersection, but you don't have a lot of visual connection. One of the sort of interesting things about this site and its layout is there's really a sort of a direct link between Centinela, where the ground here is exactly level with the street, and if you sort of run parallel down to the existing buildings and the runway, how it connects to Barker. There's a very clear linkage. And I think one of the ideas that we feel is pretty important is to try to find ways of making the park visually open to the community, giving it more presence. And although you may not enter the park at this point, that you should visually and emotionally know the park is there. That's really the front door for what we're doing. And that the idea that Barker and events that happen here could also be sort of a terminus for this link that might join all these different places together is a preliminary design idea we've really been exploring. So I want to show you 3 options, and all the different options basically are looking at 3 or 4 different criteria. And each one of the options basically prioritize those criteria differently. One of the first important things to kind of resolve is, how do we circulate? How does the circulation work for the new park? And so this option, scheme 1, we're calling the runway scheme, just so we can all address it in the same terminology. But this scheme basically says, let's keep the Douglas Loop Road where it is located. So we don't sort of change that, but we take the area of the tie-down area that's closest to the runway, and we make that a much larger parking area. And this gives us about 250 stalls of parking. And when you look at the quantities of all the fields and the park spaces and try to do parking studies for it, generally speaking, about 200 to 250 parking spaces would be the usable number for all those facilities. And so this area on the site, because of some noise issues, its proximity to the runway, seems like a really good place to put the parking. And so this scheme A basically takes the existing road and creates a loop and uses that as a parking place. Some of the disadvantages of this scheme are that the road basically goes to the middle of the park. And so to get from one end of the park to the other end of the park, you need to cross the road. And so that could be considered a disadvantage, both in terms of circulation and safety, but this certainly is a more economical solution because we're not spending the dollars to move the road or reconfigure it in some other kind of way. So there may be trade-offs with that. Scheme 1 looks at adding 3 more sports fields. So we'll have a total of 4 fields. This is the existing field right next to us right now. And we're looking at adding 3 other fields that are basically varying sizes and can be broken down in different kinds of ways. And I think we can sort of talk more about them in detail at each scheme about how those fields would be used. But you can see how they're working on the site. One of the things that we've been very conscious of is because of all the fencing requirements for fields, if you make them touch each other and align them right next to each other, you end up with these very, very, very long barriers or walls. And so in all of our schemes, we've tried to break up the connections between the fields so that we can do other things with them, whether they're places for landscape, places for circulation, places to view the games, or other kinds of amenities. But we've felt that it's really important to try to make this space have more penetrations. If we were to basically make them touch each other, there would be a wall separating this side of the park and that side of the park. And so by separating them, you get this possibility of having all these linkages and connections, which seem really important to integrate the park together. This is a diagram for our first scheme, the Runway, which looks at how those other spaces might be used. And so here you can see the existing road that comes in, and Douglas Loop goes along this area to serve the existing buildings, and the parking lot happens over here. The 4 fields, and then there is a circulation path that basically links all the fields together, which you see in this pink. And that basically is the runway. And we're seeing that as a multi-use pedestrian walkway. And there are many ways it could be organized. It might be organized by speed, so that walking might happen one place, bike riding might happen someplace else, running might happen somewhere else. But there's an idea of all these spaces are linked together by this big circulation linkage. And the cones out there that I mentioned are basically an example of how wide that would be. Those cones are located right here. Flexibility is very important. And so one of the reasons why this scheme I think is strong is because there's lots of other ways that this could be used. For example, a festival could be set up from here to here with booths and tents, and it could be occupied in many kinds of ways. So this scheme, the principal pedestrian organizing feature is this runway piece. Then in between each one of the fields, where you see this sort of green dot, is we're bringing back this landscape of the natural habitats. And so in those places, we're taking up ground, the concrete, we're regrading it, we're creating berms in various places. We're dealing with issues of water. So the water is sort of all being drained to those landscape areas. And it's also the place where we get shade. One of the things we're all very aware of here today, that it's pretty hot and sunny. And so by having these sort of serpentine landscape pieces between the fields, gives us lots of place to have shade pockets where people can hang out. And in all of our schemes, we're also trying to have other kinds of functions. And so in this scheme, for example, we're putting some community gardens in this location. And that seems like a good place for those because it's next to the parking lot, so that you can sort of park your car, use the community gardens. People see the community gardens as they're going to the park, and it gives a really nice visibility. And the last, I think, important feature of this scheme is that next to Barker, we're talking about having a community lawn. And it's most likely that all these fields are going to be artificial turf of some kind. And so it'd be nice if someplace on the park there is actually a lawn that could be used for sort of open sports or festivals or picnicking. And so we're trying to find a way that can happen in this location, which I think is a good place for because of the visibility that it has from the main street. And here is a plan of how all that might go together. And there's a lot of information on this particular drawing, but I think when you look at the plan a little closer, you'll start sort of understanding it. Again, the main road stays in its existing location, as is Douglas Loop, the new parking lot. Here are the community gardens. Here's this pedestrian walkway, which goes all the way down the site, and you see it at the end of Centinela. It does cross the street here. So this is one location where pedestrians and cars have to be careful. And off of that, there are many paths and ways you can move through the site in a much more organic and natural way. And those are the foundation for this ecological landscape that has lots of shade in it. We're proposing this scheme to build an additional restroom and storage building in 2 locations, one down in this location and one up here, and the one that's existing remains. And each one of the places in the park between the fields has a different program role. For example, we're thinking this might be a children's play area over in this location. There may be a berm here, so you can actually be up on this berm and look at the fields, or on the other side of the berm, look at the planes taking off. And the berm also gives us a lot of acoustic separation, because this is really the noisiest end of the airport here, where planes are idling and about to take off. And so this berm in this location really helps protect all the fields from the sort of the most intense location of noise. So I'm sure that you'll have lots of questions about the particulars of this scheme. I want to go through all the 3 schemes and then sort of talk about them generally and see what questions you have. But the key things about this first scheme are the road stays in its existing location. We have 3 new fields for a total of 4 fields. We have 250 parking spaces, and we have a very flexible pedestrian kind of open space that can be used and set up in lots of different kinds of ways, and definitely has a memory of the airport. Okay, scheme number 2. We're calling this one landing strips. So this scheme says, let's do something to make the whole park more continuous so a street doesn't bisect it. So this is where the existing road is. We're going to take and shift it over next to Barker, and so you'll enter at this point and connect it with Douglas Loop. The parking is in the same location, but what that allows is that now the whole park is on one continuous piece of land. There aren't cars going through it anywhere. And so just as far as safety and crossing a street and sort of activities, it certainly makes for a better environment. It does involve more capital costs as far as moving the road down, but it gives us more freedom about how we actually plan and organize that space. This scheme puts the road in between the parking. So although you don't cross when you're in the park, there is still a necessity that once you park your car, you have to cross the road to get to the park. And so there will probably be key locations where we have crosswalks, and parents might want to watch their kids at those particular points. But once you're inside the park, it's all continuous area. So this scheme also adds 3 new fields. The fields are slightly different sized, and they're in different locations. And Sports Force can talk about sort of the pros and cons of each one of those fields. We get sort of a bigger field down here, and we're taking a little bit of the dog park. Not a lot, but just sort of the very back corner in order to get that field to fit. But again, we're getting really a maximization here of the park of having lots of sports fields in it. This is a diagram of where other things are going. Here we're changing where the community gardens are located. So in this scheme, we're sort of putting it on this edge of the parking. And so it means that people going to the park are not necessarily walking through the community gardens. They see the community gardens, they're very present, but they're not sort of en route to the park. There's slight separation. We're looking at having key elements of program at each one of these points in between the fields, which you'll see in the plan. And here, we're still having a berm to give us some acoustic separation, but we're actually starting to break sort of this long pedestrian path to create sort of a special zone here that might be used for other kinds of activities and events. This scheme still has a sort of community lawn down at this end of the scheme. And because we don't have a road in this location anymore, it starts opening up to the rest of the airport, I think, in a stronger way. because now there's really a big landscape connection that you can move through in between the fields and come to the main pedestrian walkway. So this is a way that you move through from the existing restroom building and parking. You can move through here, and from the park, you can also slide through that way. And this is a plan of the scheme 2, the second option scheme, that you can see now how the road has been relocated. You can see these really strong paths that bring you from the main road through and in between the fields to link with the main pedestrian area. Now, this is really not a design scheme. This is really an organizational idea. And so you may look at this and say, why do we have pink and orange lines drawn on the paving? We're not suggesting the paving is pink and orange. All we're saying is that it's a special pedestrian space here, and that it should be developed with a lot of rich ideas, and those are yet to come once we know what we're designing. So this particular drawing is trying to give a lot of character and help us understand where things are located and what the nature is of each one of those things. And the design will develop once we know what all those locations are. So in this particular scheme, we're looking at having a new restroom area located here. And we're thinking about obviously keeping the existing restrooms over on this location. Some of the other amenities we're adding, we're looking at having some adult fitness areas. There actually is another restroom we're adding here, so we'd have a restroom there, and one over here, and a whole series of picnicking and sort of community spaces along the main walkway area. The third scheme, Flight Path, does another move with the circulation of the roadway. And instead of, we're also taking this one out, we're making the main entry be at this point next to Barker, but instead of having it line up with the existing Douglas Loop, we're actually wrapping it around over to the runways and back around and putting the parking lot on the inside of that. And the pros of this scheme are that now once you park your car, you're immediately in the park and you're not crossing any roadway. So all the issues about safety are really sort of maximized. The disadvantage of this scheme is we have a lot of roadway. And so we're paving a lot of area that we might do something else with. And so we're giving up a little more space to road and to paving than we are to ecology and garden. So one of the things that I think we're all trying to evaluate is where on the scale of having no intersections of cars and pedestrians do we want to be? Do we want to be in a scheme like this where we completely separate it and there are certain pros and cons to it? Or can we live with it between the parking and the park? Or is it okay for the park to actually have to cross it? And I think we'd like your input on all of those positions. One other thing to note about this particular scheme is that once we take and put the road around the back side of it, which makes this sort of really nice connection between the park and the parking, we get less parking in it. So because the road takes up more area, here we only have 160 stalls, where in some of the other schemes we had 250 stalls. So substantially more area goes to the road and less area goes to parking. This scheme, we're looking at adding 2 new fields, but these fields are larger fields than the 3 other fields. And so, and their orientation is all orthogonal to the existing field, which is required based on sort of the bigger dimensions of it. And because we have less fields now, we end up having more space in between the fields. And so there's a ratio of more, quote unquote, non-programmed sports park space as opposed to programmed sports park space. And so in this scheme, you can see the 3 fields, and you can see this main walkway now changes character quite a bit. It sort of aligns with this field, and then it has some other kind of place that it makes, and then it goes by the next field, and it has other kinds of community and wild habitat spaces. Then there's a very large kind of park space in the middle of the park. And in this game, we tried to concentrate as much non-recreation space in one location, so that the park would actually feel really large, the non-sports field parts of the park. And the community gardens are located here in this particular solution, assuming that this parking lot would be the main place where people would park to use those community gardens. And then we have our last field sort of up by Centinela. It's parallel to the dog park. We don't need to sort of take any of that space. And because that's the smaller of the fields, again, it gives us a lot more park space here to have other kinds of play areas and landscape pieces in it. So we're trying to dial up and dial down as a way of all of us sort of understanding the relationship between sports fields and park space and where the circulation goes in between all of those. And here is a plan of Scheme 3, flight path as we're calling it. And here you can see again the main access road, how it loops around the parking area and then ties back into the Douglas Loop. The 2 new sports fields added here and added here. This sports field is basically exactly the same size as the existing sports field. And this one is actually the same size too. I thought it was smaller, it's the same size. And then you can begin to see all the ways that we're creating movement, circulation spaces in between the fields and really trying to have one large concentration of park space. Parking is continuous with the park space so that from the parking here you move directly onto the park to circulation space. You're moving through all these spaces and you're not crossing traffic in any of the locations. Going back to our initial sort of 3 big concepts, all these really need to operate, I think, from a performance point of view. How do they really work with all the sports fields? How many do we need? What's the best orientation? How do they provide great cultural opportunities? All the spaces that sort of are in between the sports fields, and how do we make really wonderful shady places for people to watch and gather? And then the last one is ecology. How do we take and basically break up this ground plane and let nature and a natural plant successional community come back in? And so we're really looking at doing that in between the fields as places you move through, but also give you shade and more of a sense of a naturalized landscape. So the next things we're trying to do today is for you to take a couple moments here and start giving us some of your feedback. We want to ask your feedback on the 3 schemes, what you think the strengths and weaknesses are of each one of them, and then look at all the images we have of all the other kind of components that we're saying might fit in the park, and give us your own priorities of which ones you think really work, which ones are high in your scale that you'd like to have them, and which ones may not be as important. So starting next week, the Santa Monica Parks website, santamonicaparks.org, is going to be taking your thoughts and opinions. So if you don't give us thoughts today, or if you think of more thoughts over the weekend or next week, please use that website to communicate with us. And there are 2 important meetings that we're going to be presenting at. The Parks and Recreation Commission meeting is on July 21st, and the Airport Commission is on July 25th, and we'll be submitting or presenting to the council on September 13th.